Bologna, 1333. Imagine a bustling medieval city, teeming with life and contradictions. From a distance, you can see its proud towers, standing tall as witnesses to a time of glory and conflict. Within its walls, hurried merchants cross narrow, stone streets, while church bells mark the rhythm of the day. Bologna was one of the most vibrant cities in Europe at the time, home to one of the world's most prestigious universities, but also a stage for profound tensions. Here, nobles vied for power, the church struggled to maintain its authority, and ordinary people grappled with the uncertainties of daily life. It was an age of great progress, but also of great suffering. And it was in this setting, so full of contrasts, that a story of purity and holiness emerged, a story that defies human logic, something almost impossible to imagine. A young girl who, in her simplicity, drew the attention of heaven. Have you ever heard of someone dying of happiness? That is precisely what happened to Imelda Lambertini. But before revealing the end of this story, let me take you back in time, so you can better understand the era, the family, and the heart of this extraordinary girl. The Lambertini family was one of the most respected in Bologna. Her father, Eugenio Lambertini, was a man of great influence. He had served as the governor of Brescia and as an ambassador to the Republic of Venice, positions that reflected his political importance. But Eugenio was not just a man of power, he was also a man of faith. He was known for his generosity toward the poor, something rare among nobles of that time. His wife, Castora Galussi, came from another prestigious family, but she carried a silent burden in her heart. She was unable to have children. For Castora, this was an almost unbearable pain. In an era when motherhood was seen as both a divine blessing and a social duty, being childless brought constant sadness and shame. For years, she prayed to the Virgin Mary, asking for the grace to become a mother. Prayer after prayer, tear after tear, Castora never lost hope. It is said that she often spent hours kneeling before an image of Our Lady, reciting the Rosary with such devotion that even the household servants were moved to see her. And then, the impossible happened. After years of fervent prayers, Castora became pregnant. When the baby was born in 1322, it was as if joy had flooded the Lambertini household. Castora was certain that her daughter was a direct gift from the Virgin Mary. So much so that as soon as she held the baby in her arms, she made a bold promise, "O Lady, this child is entirely yours. I offer her completely. Take her under your care." Imagine the power of this declaration, made with a heart overflowing with gratitude. Imelda grew up surrounded by love, but from an early age, she showed she was different from other children. While girls her age enjoyed running through the fields or playing with dolls, Imelda seemed drawn to something far greater. She loved hearing stories about God, the saints, and heaven, and spent hours in front of a small altar she had set up. In her room, decorating it with fresh flowers and candles, the household staff were intrigued by her behavior. They would say, "This child has something special. It's as if her heart was already in heaven." And indeed, from a very young age, Imelda began to show signs of an extraordinary vocation. At just 8 years old, she surprised her parents by announcing that she wanted to join a monastery. Imagine the scene, such a small child, yet with an unshakable determination, asking to dedicate herself completely to God. Eugenio and Castora were deeply moved, but also hesitant. It was difficult to imagine their only daughter, their beloved little girl, leaving the comfort of home to live within the austere walls of a convent. However, when they saw the seriousness in Imelda's expression, they realized that her desire wasn't a childish whim, but a genuine calling. At the time, it was common for children to be admitted as oblates in monasteries, a sort of religious apprenticeship before taking formal vows. And so, at the age of 8, Imelda was welcomed into the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria Maddalena di Val di Ser Pietra. This monastery was located outside the walls of Bologna, surrounded by quiet, green hills. To many, it might have seemed like an isolated and lifeless place, but to Imelda, it was paradise. There, she found her true family, the nuns who welcomed her as their youngest sister. In the convent, Imelda was a radiant presence. Although she was just a child, her devotion was so profound that the other sisters were amazed. Many times, they saw her kneeling in the chapel, her eyes fixed on the tabernacle, as if she was speaking directly with Jesus. Imelda seemed to live in a constant state of prayer. Her humility and joy were contagious, and even the most seasoned sisters found themselves inspired by her purity. But there was one thing that occupied Imelda's thoughts more than anything else: the Eucharist. To her, the real presence of Jesus in the bread and wine was the greatest mystery and the most incredible gift God could offer. Whenever she attended Mass, she was mesmerized watching the nuns approach the altar to receive communion. Imelda couldn't understand how anyone could go on living their normal lives after receiving God Himself into their hearts. To her, the Eucharist was so sublime that it should completely transform the life of whoever received it. And this was where her greatest sorrow emerged. Because she was so young, Imelda was not yet allowed to receive communion. At that time, the Church had established a minimum age for First Communion, and Imelda had not yet reached that age. But how could anyone explain this to a young girl whose heart burned with longing for Jesus? Imelda accepted the rules with obedience, but her desire for the Eucharist only grew stronger. Many times, she would ask the Mother Superior or the confessor, "When will I be able to receive communion?" The answer was always the same: "Not yet, my child, you must wait." This waiting was a great suffering for Imelda, but it was also an opportunity for her to grow even deeper in her faith. Each day, she renewed her longing for the Eucharist, offering her prayers and small sacrifices as a way of preparing herself for that most anticipated moment. Deep down, she knew that when she finally received Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, it would be the happiest day of her life. And perhaps, in some mysterious way, she also knew that this moment would mark the end of her earthly journey. And so, Imelda continued her daily life at the convent, living with a fervor that seemed almost superhuman for a girl her age. Little did she know that heaven already had an extraordinary plan reserved for her. What happened next would transform her brief life into an eternal story of love and devotion. But let's take a step further in this moving narrative. Are you ready to hear about the moment when heaven quite literally descended to earth to answer the prayer of a little girl? From her earliest years, Imelda seemed guided by something greater. Unlike other children of noble families who spent their days running through courtyards or amusing themselves with games and toys, Imelda had an unusual interest for her age: God. Her caretakers often recalled finding her standing quietly before the altar in the family chapel, her eyes shining and her small hands clasped in prayer. "Lord, I want to love you forever," she would whisper with such heartfelt sincerity that even the adults around her were moved. But it wasn't just her faith that set her apart. It was how she lived that faith. Even as a little girl, Imelda demonstrated a profound sense of charity. Whenever she saw beggars at the door of her house, and there were many since her father was known for his generosity, she would insist on personally bringing them food and water. Speaking with each one of them, she gave them whatever she could, often giving up her own possessions. One day, after giving her blanket to a shivering child, she told her mother, "Jesus warms me more than anything else." These acts left her family and friends in awe. Her parents, Egano and Castora, were proud, but deep in their hearts, they sensed that their daughter didn't fully belong to them. From the moment Imelda was born, Castora, who had prayed so fervently to the Virgin Mary for a child, felt there was something special about her, something that could only be a divine calling. At the age of 8, Imelda made a decision that would change her life forever. During a family dinner, she surprised her parents by saying sweetly, yet with conviction, "Mama, Papa, I want to live for Jesus. I want to go to the monastery." Castora nearly dropped the chalice she was holding. Egano furrowed his brow, clearly caught off guard. "But you're so young, my daughter," he tried to reason. Imelda, however, remained steadfast. "God is already speaking to me, Papa. I know He wants me to be with Him." After much reflection and prayer, her parents decided to give in. Although the thought of letting their only daughter go filled Castora's heart with sorrow, she knew it was part of God's plan. And so, Imelda was brought to the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria Maddalena di Val di Pietra, a simple and quiet place nestled in the hills outside Bologna. For an 8-year-old girl, the change could have been overwhelming, but Imelda seemed radiant. To her, this place was heaven on earth. The nuns at the convent were delighted by the arrival of their newest member. It was unusual to receive an oblate so young, but Imelda already seemed to possess the spiritual maturity of an adult. From her very first day, she embraced all the activities of the monastery with contagious joy, whether it was scrubbing the chapel floor, helping in the kitchen, or participating in the long hours of prayer. What stood out the most, however, was her devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Whenever she had a free moment, Imelda would rush to the chapel and kneel before the tabernacle, contemplating the mystery of Jesus' presence in the Eucharist. The nuns often whispered among themselves, "This child lives as if she's already in heaven." Imelda had one great desire: to receive communion. To her, the Eucharist was the greatest gift anyone could receive, the most intimate union with Jesus possible. Her eyes would light up as she watched the nuns approach the altar to receive the sacred host, and her heart felt as though it might burst with love. Yet there was one problem. At that time, children were not allowed to receive communion until they reached a certain age, and at just 10 years old, Imelda was still considered too young. This restriction was a heavy cross for her to bear, but she carried it with patience. Many times she would ask the Mother Superior or the convent's priest, "When will I be able to receive communion?" The answer was always the same: "Not yet, my child, you must wait." And although Imelda obeyed, she couldn't help but feel a pang in her heart each time she heard those words. How can Jesus himself wait to come into the heart of a child who loves him so much, she wondered. Despite the waiting, Imelda did not let her spirit falter. On the contrary, she saw her inability to receive communion as an opportunity to prepare herself even more deeply for the moment when she would finally welcome Jesus in the Eucharist. She offered every small sacrifice throughout her day, from the simplest chores to the challenges of life in the monastery, as a way of saying to Jesus, "I am ready. Come dwell in my heart." May 12, 1333 began like any other day at the convent, but it would end in a way that no one could have foreseen. It was the eve of the Feast of the Ascension, and the nuns had gathered in the chapel for the divine office, followed by the celebration of Mass. Imelda, as always, was kneeling in the back of the chapel, her eyes fixed on the altar, her mind fully absorbed in God. At the time of communion, as the nuns rose to receive the Eucharist, Imelda remained kneeling, praying silently. In her heart, she repeated the same plea she had made so many times before. "My Jesus, I love you. Come to me, Lord, come to me." And then something inexplicable happened. A bright light began to radiate from the ciborium the priest was holding. The nuns froze in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then, before everyone's eyes, a small host rose from the ciborium and floated through the air as if guided by invisible hands. It traced a luminous path across the chapel and gently came to rest above Imelda's head. The nuns, stunned, began to weep. Some immediately fell to their knees, realizing they were witnessing a miracle. The priest, his eyes filled with tears, approached Imelda, took the host, and placed it in her mouth. Imelda closed her eyes, her face radiant with joy. It was as if her entire soul was being consumed by this moment of perfect union with Jesus. When the Mass ended, the nuns noticed that Imelda hadn't moved. Her expression remained serene, but her body was still. When they called her name, she didn't respond. Imelda had passed away. Her heart could not bear the overwhelming happiness of being so close to God. Imelda's death was seen as a divine sign, and her story quickly spread throughout Bologna. People began to venerate her as a saint, seeing her as a perfect example of purity and love for the Eucharist. In 1826, Pope Leo XIV officially approved her veneration, and in 1908, St. Pius VI declared her the patroness of children preparing for their first communion. Her body, miraculously incorrupt, remains on display in the chapel of St. Sigismund in Bologna, where pilgrims from all over the world come to pay their respects. There are some fascinating facts about Blessed Imelda Lambertini that highlight the depth of her holiness and the impact of her short but extraordinary life. Imelda is often called the girl who died of happiness. Her death, after receiving her first communion, was so peaceful and supernatural that it is believed she literally could not contain the joy of having Jesus in her heart. Although she lived in the 14th century, Imelda's body remains incorrupt to this day. It is preserved in the chapel of St. Sigismund in Bologna, where pilgrims from around the world come to venerate her. This is seen as a sign of her purity and sanctity. Blessed Imelda is recognized as the patroness of children preparing for their first communion. Her story is especially shared with young ones as an example of love and devotion to the Eucharist, encouraging them to approach this sacrament with a pure and faithful heart. The miracle of the host that floated toward Imelda is unique in the history of the Church. While there are many accounts of Eucharistic miracles, this is one of the few where the host visibly moved toward a person, interpreted as a clear manifestation of God's divine will to fulfill the little girl's request. In popular tradition, it is said that Imelda's behavior was so angelic that the nuns at the convent believed she was born to be a saint. They often referred to her as the little sister from heaven, a testament to her deep spirituality. Despite her short life, Imelda was already known for her remarkable spiritual maturity. Her ability to endure the wait for the Eucharist without rebellion, but with obedience and patience, is considered an extraordinary example of virtue, even for adults. The day of her death, May 12th, is celebrated as her liturgical feast. In Italy, particularly in Bologna, it is common for children preparing for their first communion to visit the chapel where Blessed Imelda's body lies, asking for her intercession to experience this special moment with the same fervor she did. Imelda always used flowers to decorate the small altar she set up in her home and later at the convent. These flowers were seen as symbols of her purity and the love she offered to Jesus. For this reason, many images and statues of her depict her holding flowers, usually white lilies. Though she lived in a time of deep political and religious divisions, Imelda's life was universally recognized as a model of innocence and unwavering faith. Her story became a message of unity amid the turmoil of her society. An interesting fact is that even though she is a blessed and not a canonized saint, Imelda has a widespread devotion, especially in Italy. This demonstrates how her story continues to inspire people even more than 700 years after her death. The story of Blessed Imelda Lambertini is like a delicate flame that illuminates our hearts, challenging us to look toward the simplicity of faith and the transformative power of love for God. When I reflect on the life of this girl, who barely reached adolescence and yet was so profoundly united with Christ, I can't help but feel humbled, comparing her absolute devotion with the way we often live out our faith, hurried, distracted, or even lukewarm. Imelda had no power, wealth, or enough time in this world to accomplish great visible deeds. But what she did, loving God with all her heart, is, in truth, the hardest and yet the most essential thing. Her story reminds me that it's not the size of our actions that matters, but the depth of our love for God. She teaches us that even the smallest among us can be great in the eyes of the Lord when they live with a purity of heart that reflects heaven. Another aspect of Imelda's story that deeply moves me is her burning desire for the Eucharist. Today, we live in a time when the Eucharist is so accessible to many of us, yet paradoxically, we often forget what it truly means to receive Jesus in the sacrament. Imelda teaches us not to treat this as something ordinary or routine, but as the greatest miracle, the most intimate encounter we can have with God in this life. She longed so deeply for her first communion that she not only prayed for it, but offered her entire day as a gift to God, preparing herself in body and soul. And what about us? Do we still have that same fervor, or have we allowed our faith to grow cold under the weight of daily concerns? Imelda's death, so mysterious and yet so beautiful, makes me reflect on how much we remain attached to the fleeting things of this world. She didn't die from sadness or suffering, but from happiness, because her soul had found what it had been searching for: Jesus. It makes me wonder how often we seek happiness in the wrong places, in material accomplishments or human recognition, forgetting that our true joy can only be complete in God. Moreover, Imelda's story reminds me of the importance of a living, childlike faith that fully trusts in the Lord. Hers was not a complicated faith filled with doubts. It was simple, pure, and entirely surrendered. It's a call for each of us, no matter our age or how long we've been walking in faith, to strive for that simplicity that we so often lose over the years. There is also something even deeper in Imelda's message, the reminder that God hears even our smallest prayers. Her silent plea was answered in a miraculous way, as if heaven wanted to shout to the world, "I see the pure and loving heart of this little girl." This makes me reflect on how much we underestimate the power of our prayers, especially when they are made with love and sincerity. God truly listens, even when it seems He is silent. Finally, Blessed Imelda's life leaves me with a lesson of hope. We live in a noisy, hectic world, full of distractions and an insatiable thirst for success and instant results. Yet Imelda shows us that true fulfillment lies in living each moment with God at the center. She didn't perform spectacular miracles during her life, didn't preach to crowds, and didn't leave behind great writings, but her love for Jesus in the Eucharist touched God's heart and inspired generations. This proves that to become a saint, we don't need to be great in the eyes of the world, but faithful even in the smallest things. Imelda's story is an invitation to reassess our priorities, to seek God above all else, and to treasure the spiritual gifts we have within our reach. Above all, her life serves as a reminder that in the end, what truly matters is how much we have loved and surrendered ourselves to the Lord. After all, as Imelda showed us, only love can bring us to heaven. Prayer to Blessed Imelda Lambertini. O sweet and pure Blessed Imelda, who from such a young age loved Jesus with all your heart and ardently long to receive the Holy Eucharist, teach us to value the great gift of the Blessed Sacrament. You, who were consumed with the joy of being united with Christ, help us renew our love for him, living every communion as if it were the first, the last, and the only one. Intercede for us before the Lord, so that we may cultivate within our hearts a faith that is simple, humble, and fervent, capable of overcoming the distractions and challenges of this world. Help us to always seek heaven as you did, and to live with purity of heart and generosity, dedicating our lives to God's service and the good of others. Blessed Imelda, patroness of children receiving their first communion, protect all innocent souls and inspire in each of us a true hunger for the Eucharist, so that we may be strengthened by the bread of angels and remain steadfast on the path to holiness. Beloved daughter of Mary, guide us in preparing our hearts for our encounter with Jesus, both now and for all eternity. Amen. The story of Blessed Imelda Lambertini is an invitation for everyone to reflect on the true value of faith and love for Jesus in the Eucharist. Her short life teaches us that true happiness is not found in material things, but in union with God, lived with purity, simplicity, and a heart full of love. What a beautiful example she gives us, especially in how we should approach the Eucharist with fervor, joy, and a sincere desire to be close to Christ. If you felt this story touched your heart, subscribe to Journey of the Saints, Sacred Stories, to discover more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends and family. Your support is so important in helping us spread messages of faith and inspiration. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What does the story of Blessed Imelda Lambertini teach you about the value of the Eucharist in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing your reflections. And before you go, don't forget to check out one of the videos above, specially chosen for you. I'm sure it will inspire you just as much. May God bless you and see you in the next video.